Hey folks, before we get started, I just wanted to tell you, you can unlock unlimited access to political news, commentary, opinion, and a whole lot more at inforum.news/port for only 99 cents a month for your first 3 months. Hurry, get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes, empowering our vehicles, to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk. It's Wednesday, so of course that means Chad Oban will be co-hosting with me. And we're going to be talking in just a moment with the North Dakota House of Representatives Minority Leader, Representative Josh Boschee. He's a Democrat from Fargo. And we're going to be talking about all sorts of stuff because the Democratic State Convention is actually coming up this weekend. And that's going to be a lot of fun. Before we get started, of course, remember, if you want to support the podcast, you want to get access to a lot of awesome content, my content, but if you don't like my content, we got a lot of other people too, so you can check that out. If you go to inforum.news/port, you can get 3 months. If you're not already subscribed, you get 3 months for 99 cents a month. After that, it's like $10 a month. And if you subscribe to one of the papers, the Forum, you get them all. You get the Jamestown Sun, Grand Forks Herald. It's a great deal, I think. But of course, I get paid to say that, so who knows? And also, if you're listening to this via streaming, consider subscribing via like Spotify or something. You can get notified of new episodes. That's a real cool way to listen. All right, let's get right to it. Representative Boschee, how you doing?
Good, I'm doing great. It's good to be on my way back to the hometown of Minot to see family and gather with all our Democratic friends this weekend.
Yeah, that's right. I'm gonna gather with all your Democratic friends this weekend as well. So that should be a lot of fun. I've never been to a state Democratic convention before. It's been a couple of years since we've had one because of COVID. So, this one's going to be hybrid. So there's certainly not going to be as many people there physically, but a lot of folks beaming in from around the state to participate. Always before, the reason why because I've been writing about politics in North Dakota for a long time, and always before, it was just really hard for me to get there because it was kind of a choice. Like you said, we haven't had them for a while because of COVID and stuff. And then I think 1 year it was like the Republican and the Democratic was at the same time. I think was that 2016? I think that was 2016. And like Ted Cruz and everybody was coming to we had presidential candidates and stuff at the Republican convention. And there's just, honestly, there's just usually not a lot of competitive races at the Democratic convention. So the Republican one was always more interesting. If I had to choose, I was going to choose that one. But this time around, we have one statewide candidate announced, Trygve Hammer, from the Minot area as well, from near Velva, just southeast of Minot. He's going to be running for the Public Service Commission. Any other news on other candidates? We're going to see some stepping forward here as we come down to it.
Yeah, I've started to hear, I believe there'll be a Secretary of State candidate announced in the next day or two. And then, of course, that convention, I think at least the stories I've heard from the old guard within the Democratic Party is that, and I assume it was the same way within the Republican Party, that, a lot of times these announcements wouldn't happen until the convention. The idea that people are getting out ahead and the races and the elections are getting longer and longer is more of a modern day process. So, it's always fun and excitement, and I think to see who comes out of the crowd and says, I'm ready to take on Attorney General, or I'm ready to take on Public Service Commission. And, sometimes you just got to be around the family to get some of that final encouragement to say, yeah, I'll sign on the dotted line and let's go for it.
So, Josh, what's the pitch for Democrats this election? There's going to be a lot of competitive legislative races in the eastern part of the state. Obviously, statewide, they're starting to announce, but why should people vote for Democrats?
I think first and foremost, we need more balance in our decision making. The Republican Party has been a super majority party for well over a decade now in the legislature, as well as most, if not all, the statewide offices. We've seen the congressional delegation shift. And what we find is when one party has control, the balance and the accountability isn't there. And so I think of things like the Public Service Commission at a time where we are continuing to see how Energy is changing not only in the marketplace, but also from a regulatory standpoint, from one administration to the next. Having a balance of ideas and relationships on a three-person board that's elected by North Dakotans, I think is a good idea. And, say what people want to say about the partisan makeup of the legislature and the fact that we as Democrats right now are in a super minority. You can't hide from the fact that a number of the good ideas that passed in the legislature were Democratic ideas to begin with, or passed with the support of Democrats. And we've found that even though there's a few number of us, we often are part of the ruling majority. There's a reason Medicaid expansion is the rule of law in North Dakota. There's a reason why nearly 70% of our K-12 education funding from the state is coming from Bismarck and helping support local school districts. When we look at local economic development, if just the GOP was voting alone, a lot of those initiatives may not have passed. But because the Democrats are a part of the conversation, a part of the moderation of making sure we have good ideas that are taking care of North Dakotans, we have great success.
I would argue, first of all, because every cycle, I think I hear that, where, well, we need more balance, and then the voters cast their ballots, and it's pretty clear to me. I don't know that the voters are all that interested in the balance that you're talking about. I mean, just based on election outcomes. And I would argue maybe that part of the success, I mean, Republicans have been in power for a long time. I mean, really, if you want to go back to, Ed Schaefer kind of kicking things off, I mean, you're going back 30 years. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Republicans have been very pragmatic. They are the supermajority. They've had the majority. They don't ever have to accept a Democratic idea if they don't want to, but yet they do pretty consistently. And I would argue that's probably a big reason why they've been successful, is there's a pragmatism there. Would you agree with that?
Certainly. And I think that pragmatism goes back to the policies that, I just talked about. And I think a lot of that's going to be threatened over the next decade. Certainly having the supermajority and working with Democrats, or being North Dakota Republicans who, get out, haven't been leading with some of this national narrative and the stuff that leads from the edges or from the extremes of either party. We're now seeing that lived out in the GOP. And we're going to see it at their convention the weekend after ours. And that's concerning for me, because I think you're exactly right. Because we have passed pragmatic solutions to North Dakota problems, that's all going to be threatened. And unlike a lot of other conservative states, specifically in the South, that had strong Republican majorities for a while, and now we're seeing more balance come forward in terms of legislators becoming more Democratic or electing more Democrats, or even a Secretary of State or a governor being elected, is because that extremism is hurting the people in those states. Medicaid expansion is going to be on the line this next legislative session. Rural hospitals that have not closed, and we've been fortunate have not impacted our communities, are likely to be threatened. K-12 public education is, we've continued to see an erosion or an attempt at taking away public funding for public schools. We're going to see even more of that as we see groups like the conservative GOP wing, the Boschee, grow in the legislature and potentially even get statewide offices.
Josh, one of my things that I often say is, if you're running as a Democrat in North Dakota, you often have to work twice as hard, be twice as smart, and raise twice as much money in order to win. And that's often because of sort of the national narrative coming from Washington, as I think both parties are maybe getting a little more extreme in Washington. It really hurts down ballot Democrats here. So a couple softball questions. Do you think that we should dig for coal, drill for oil, and do you want to take away people's guns?
I think we should take advantage of the natural resources that North Dakota has. So if I'm supposed to say, yes, we dig for coal and we drill for oil, let's do it in a responsible way. Let's do it in a way that works with the marketplace. I mean, and when's the last time anyone has knocked on anyone's door to take their gun? I see the joke about, well, it shouldn't be a joke, but about Ukraine right now. There's a meme going around, and people are saying, see, the government took all their guns. And no, the government gave the resistance the guns that they have now, and we helped with that and are continuing to help with it. And so maybe that was a verge off of the conversation, but no, Democrats are not going to take guns. We want responsible gun ownership. We want to work with hunters and gun owners. Democrats own guns. Democrats work in the energy sector and the agriculture sector. We live in rural America. And, I often say and remind even people within our party that in the 2020 election, 110,000 North Dakotans voted for the state auditor. And I use the state auditor because no one really knows what the state auditor does, right? But it's a position on the ballot that 110,000 people made a conscious choice to fill in the Democratic circle. Now, certainly that's approximately 35% of the vote, but that still tells us that there are North Dakotans who believe in democratic values. And just because we may not win the majority doesn't mean that we should be dismissed in our ideas. And I go back to the pragmatic ideas or policies that have been initiated in North Dakota. And my concern is over the next decade, that's going to be eroded, not because of the lack of Democrats, but because the GOP, I've told many of my GOP leader friends, you guys are rolling over. You are letting this extreme wing of your party take over. I'm sad to see the resignations or the retirements that have been announced. The fact that we are going to lose very strong independent leaders like Chet Pollert and Rich Wardner, Ray Holmberg from Senate Appropriations, who has been able to help invest in K-12 education and higher ed. I am very concerned about this next session. And it's not because there's not enough Democrats. It's because the Republicans are giving up and walking away. The adults in the room are leaving. Now, people have their own personal reasons, and I'm not going to chastise or blame them for that. It's just that as part of that, by being a party in control, they also aren't used to organizing. They haven't turned out 25 or 50 people of their friends to vote for the senator or the representative to replace them. They've just let the random members show up and take over. And it takes work. Democracy is fragile, and it's something we have to work towards.
You're right. I share your, although some of the people you mentioned in the resignations, I mean, like Ray Holmberg, he'd been there over 40 years. He cited some medical reasons. Rich Wardner certainly been there a long time as well. I mean, some of those retirements, I think were just age. I mean, it was just time. They'd been there for a long time and they want to retire, and hey, good on them. They put in their service. Some of the other ones like Nicole Pullman, I think you look at some of those, and I think it's just maybe at least a part of her decision was just being fed up. And I think that's very frustrating. I mean, this is happening I'm a conservative, right? I care very deeply about the conservative movement. And some of the things you're mentioning about Medicare expansion, you and I could disagree on those things, right? Because I'm not so sure, the way we spend our government money, I think you and I are probably trying to reach the same ends. We just have very different paths for getting there. But as somebody who's been in the chamber and who's kind of looking across that chamber into the Republican caucus and seeing a lot of the things going on, what's your reaction to it? I mean, it's been a wild couple of years for the North Dakota Republican Party.
Yeah, this might be an interesting comment, but I tell folks, especially now that I've been in leadership 2 sessions, and I was not in leadership when Al Carlson was the House Majority Leader. But the credit I give Al Carlson is he led and he ruled as Majority Leader. But Chet Pollert didn't, and Chet's not a politician. He's not a strategist. He's a good guy who is serving his community. But what we've seen is there is not the party structure using leadership or using the power that a leader might have to hold, whether it's chairs accountable or members accountable. We saw how messy things got with Luke Simons, and thankfully the chamber made the right decision there in terms of expelling him, not necessarily just for his actions, but the way he responded to the chamber about his actions. And my fear is that by us losing more good, like I said, the adults in the room of the Republican Party, the Senate specifically, which we depended on, the House has always been like a crazy family reunion. You have all stripes and all different ideologies in the House because it's a larger body. But the Senate has been a much more moderating force, and in our state government has been where bad ideas have gone to die and good things have flourished. And I'm fearful that those days are gone, especially as we see some of the Boscheeats gain endorsements in their districts for Senate seats specifically.
Josh, I think one of the hardest parts about being in the minority, super minority, or less super minority, is trying to figure out the balance between punching the majority and holding them accountable and being at the table to work for policy solutions. I mean, the reality is, there's not many people in your caucus, there's not many people in the Dem caucus, but there's serious lawmakers there who go to Bismarck in order to be at the table to find solutions. But then the politics of it all is when you're working to find those pragmatic solutions on K through 12 funding and all those different things, it's harder to run against the other party. You have a great relationship with the governor's office. You have a great relationship with the majority parties. How do you go about sort of balancing those two things? Because your districts also deserve elected officials who are going to go to Bismarck and work on policy, not just play politics.
Right. Yeah, especially when we only have 80 days to vote on around 900 pieces of legislation. So I think you're exactly right, Chad. And that is a challenge, and our caucus has talked a lot about in terms of, when do we throw punches? And if we throw them, when I'm talking politics by throwing punches, making sure that it's rational, making sure that it has to do with the policy initiatives that we're fighting for, not personality, not about whether we like someone or not, but it's based around how do we govern and what are we governing in the policies that we're passing. And that's been tough too, because as we have only a few members on different policy committees or on the appropriations committee, our members need to build those relationships similar to I have to have good working relationships with the majority leader in the governor's office to make sure that I'm respected when I'm at the table and the things I say aren't necessarily just being said because I'm a Democrat, but because I'm a North Dakotan who loves my state and wants to make sure that we're taking care of people and maybe not the people that usually are at the table. And how do we make sure those perspectives are taken into consideration? And so, how do you do it? I think we're going to see a shift in that again as we see this growing extremism. One thought, and maybe I'm showing my cards by sharing this on this podcast, but when I don't have, Rich Wardner, Joan Heckaman, Chet Pollert, the four leaders, we have all worked well together over the last couple sessions. I am proud of many of the things that we have been able to pass and many of the things we've been able to not get passed. We've gone through a pandemic, we've gone through a special session, we've invested in North Dakota, but those aren't the people I'm going to be working with. I don't know who I'm going to be working with in the next session, if I'm fortunate enough to be reelected myself. And so you have to figure out from the, what's the chess table look like and who are the players and are they going to be serious leaders or are they there to throw ideology around and vote no when we're going to have a multi-billion-dollar surplus potentially?
I think a lot of when I've been watching the problems that have been happening in the Republican Party, a lot of it is, and I think because this kind of confounds people, because usually when we talk about politics, people complain about the politicians, right? It's a top-down problem. And I'm not so sure that we don't have a bottom-up problem right now, because it seems like what the politicians are doing is pandering to what, not insignificant portions of their constituencies want, which is reactionary policies based on whatever the hot button issue of the day is, critical race theory or whatever. They want, they want punches, right? They want people punching other people, and they want them saying, and they don't really care about the whole, well, at some point we have to pass a budget, right? Because the Constitution requires us to fund education. We have to pass the budget, right? Like that's, at some point you have to do it. At some point you have to strike a deal with people. And I think there's a lot of constituents, right and left, frankly, who don't want it. Now in North Dakota, a lot of it's on the right because North Dakota is culturally a pretty conservative place. But I got to think you guys have the same problem on the left, which is a lot of times constituents who just want you to go and fight.
Yeah.
The guy who has to be on the ballot does not want to answer that question. I think maybe you're
No. I mean, there is extremism in both parties, but I guess as somebody who is at most of the meetings within the Democratic Party, whether it's district level meetings or statewide meetings or on Zoom calls, I can tell you that while certainly there's extremism in the Democratic Party, there is also, I think, a much more there's reasonableness. And I think it's because some of those folks who we might label extreme or extremely liberal have recognized that maybe they're not going to get what they want if they keep screaming and yelling.
Yeah.
And it's learning from what the work we've done as far as building relationships and building stakeholders and organizing in your community. And you can pass good policy that way.
Yeah, and let me rephrase, because I wasn't making like a both sides argument. I wasn't just trying to say, oh, Republicans, Democrats are just as bad. That wasn't what I was saying. I guess it was more as an elected official, how do you bridge that gap with, like, when sometimes you have constituents who just want you to go and issue, throw bombs and do a lot of that kind of stuff, play the political game. how do you balance that with the reality that you got to govern? And I think Republicans are having a hard time because they have a big part of their caucus that is just there to throw bombs. I think that's what Republicans are dealing with. As an elected leader, how do you bridge that gap?
Sure. No, one thing I think I do an effective job, and my seatmates in our district 44 North Fargo, is we just are constantly communicating with our voters, with our neighbors. We are talking about what's really happening, what our perspective is, and what we feel, and we take input. And so then when we do, quote unquote, throw bombs or try to hold people publicly accountable and maybe throw out a zinger or two, I think they see that, well, that's not the usual of how Josh and Carla and Marilyn interact, or Zach Ista or Kathy Hogan, Gretchen Dobrovich, some of these legislators who are very well respected on their committees. But there is a time and a place for when you need to hold people publicly accountable, and how you do that matters. So,
and don't get me wrong. As I believe in the art of the polemic, clearly, because I do it for a living. So it's not sharp elbows that I have a problem with. It's just when that's the only thing, and we never get around to the substance. That's the problem. Chad, I'm sorry. Did we lose Chad?
Yeah, sorry, I froze up for a second there. Are you with me?
Yeah, we're here.
Yep.
Yeah. My computer just periodically, when Rob starts talking, it just freezes up.
It's my fault. All right.
For the good of my mental health. So, Josh, just thinking forward, I mean, you have to win re-election the next session. You've hit on this some, and I think it's a nervousness that I feel thinking about the Senate. If all the endorsed Republicans go on to win the primary, and the House changing, what does the session look like from your perspective if you do have a Boschee elected to leadership in the House and you have new leadership in the Senate with maybe a larger Boschee caucus? And Rob and I have talked a lot about this. I think the strategy of sort of throwing a bone to the Boscheeats on watered down versions of masks or vaccines or those kind of CRT and other things has not been effective in sort of appeasing that wing of the Republican Party. Instead, it's made them feel more powerful. Mm-hmm. So what happens if those guys win and we go into the next session? I mean, do you just see chaos? Because to Rob's point, you do have to balance the budget. You do have to pass appropriations. You can't just focus all your time on messaging bills and using Rob's word, Tucker Carlson bills during the next session. I mean, what does this look like if the GOP doesn't elect good, thoughtful, moderate people to the legislature?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, what my crystal ball is showing, and we'll have more information next week after many of the budget committees meet in the interim, we're going to have a potentially a record surplus of revenue again. That's because all our savings accounts are full. The buckets are filling and spilling over into the secondary and final buckets. We've provided tax relief to North Dakotans. Oil prices have been high, which fills the legacy fund and our education fund. Egg commodities are projected to be very high, so that'll carry over into the next biennium in terms of the revenue we receive. So if we have more elected Bosscheeats or extreme Republicans elected at a time when we have record surplus and money to invest back in North Dakota, and one of their mantras is to vote no on spending, we can only cut taxes so much, especially income taxes in this state. I mean, they're so low to begin with, and there's a reason why North Dakotans aren't screaming about income tax. They're screaming about their property tax. So that is my biggest concern, or what I see the mess is because as you talk about, there a lot of these messaging bills end up being policy-wise. And as we've seen a growing number of Bosscheeats elected in the GOP caucuses, what that means is we're taking good, reasonable people off the policy committees and putting them on the appropriations committee to protect the appropriations process. So then that leaves the policy committees, whether it's education or human services or industry, business, and labor, to just run amok and be obnoxious at times and not thoughtful in the policies that they're trying to pass. And we hear that from the industry groups and the stakeholder groups who say, it's just hard to come in front of a committee and try to make positive change or defend against overregulation in different areas because there's not a serious, rational conversation happening in the policy committees. And so that's what I see is going to be the interesting mess. It's not only probably the extreme number of obnoxious bills introduced that really don't impact North Dakota, but the amount of time we spend there, and then the ability for us to thoughtfully invest in North Dakota with the maybe one-time or long-term resources we have to stabilize different aspects of our economy.
Just to illustrate your point about, because I think there's a conservative case to be made against not using these revenue surpluses to necessarily just slash and burn the tax code. I believe that everybody should have some skin in the game in paying for their government. If for no other reason to keep people interested in the size of government, right? Call me old-fashioned, but I feel like you should have to pay for your government. And if the government gets bigger, you should have to pay more, right? And then we can make the decision about whether or not bigger government is worth the price. And we can have that debate. But when we sort of divorce people from the cost of their government, and you may even find some surprising allies in the oil industry who don't necessarily want to be the only horse hooked to the wagon of North Dakota state government. I can understand that as an industry not wanting to be like, you're going to put all the tax burden on us, and you're going to free everybody else. And I mean, that's a bad idea. Not to mention the fact that in probably 30 years, we're not going to have or 20 years, I don't know what it is, we're not going to probably have the oil tax revenues. We don't want to put all the eggs in that basket. Just as a matter of principle, everybody should have some responsibility to pay for some level of their government. That's a bad idea, but I'm afraid the reactionary thing is going to be, we have all this money, cut all the taxes. And, I think that gets to the very point where that's not a thoughtful approach.
Yeah, no, I agree. And maybe, we have an opportunity to look at how do we deliver government more effectively to all North Dakotans. I represent North Fargo. Fargo, Bismarck, Minot, Grand Forks is always going to have some level of delivery of services because we have people to be hired into those jobs and we have the populations in terms of where the offices will be. But you talk to people up in Rolette County or Towner County and their frustrations with the fact that the DMV is only open like 4 hours a week. And if you can't take off that Wednesday to get up there and take your CDL test or to get your driver's license, rural North Dakota, who is represented by Republicans and in some cases Boschee, extreme conservatives, are the ones suffering the most, whether it's social services, whether it's making sure that we're paying teachers and providing support staff to schools, but even township roads. We finally, this last session, were able to fight past some Bosseats who voted against township funding for their own communities so that when we have years like this year where there's 7 or 8 or 9, whatever number of blizzards, they can pay the plow driver to clear the roads. And so we have to think about how do we deliver so that people can choose North Dakota, whether they decide to live in Fargo, Minot, or Rolla, or Hettinger, that they will have a good quality of life, good education, good roads, and good systems of government.
Did you hear that, Chad? That sounded like an endorsement for my Just Plow the Damn Roads party, right?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, Rob is the founding member of the Plow the Damn Roads caucus in the state of North Dakota. No, I think that's, Rob, going back to your comments earlier, though, about we have to pay for the size of government we choose to have. I think one of the things that's often missed in these conversations is candidates. We're going to cut all the taxes, but you're going to have the same level of funding and all these things. You talk about the DMV up in rural North Dakota. You can't cut all the taxes and have that. And I think, maybe with the Bakken at times, we've been able to lower taxes and increase spending.
We can give we've had windows of time where we can give the appearance that that's possible because of what's happening in the oil fields.
But our politicians need to be honest with voters. We have to pay for the government we want. You can't fund our schools on hopes and promises and smiles. So I thought that was a good point, Rob. And
you guys are conservative, but to me, I consider that a conservative value. You should price government appropriately, right? The price of your government should be transparent, and you should feel it because it's your government too. It serves all of us. So. One thing I did want to get, because we're coming up on the end of our time with Josh, but the term limits thing, and there's two parts. First of all, do you support term limits as an idea? Because I think that runs into some of the things we're talking about, like the talent pool and having serious-minded people. Some of the people you mentioned could not have had the careers they had in the legislature. Ray Holmberg, Joan Heckaman, Chet Pollert, Rich Wardner. They couldn't have if we had term limits. So do you support term limits as a concept? And second of all, what do you think of what just happened with the Secretary of State's office and the term limits measure?
Yeah. You know, had you asked me a year ago in terms of whether I supported term limits, my gut reaction probably would have been yes. And that probably was a partisan response in terms of we know we have a supermajority.
We've been electing too many Republicans,
right, to chip away. But thinking more thoughtfully about it over the year and hearing different perspectives, exactly as you're alluding to, Rob, some of our best statesmen and stateswomen have people who have served for a long time. And we already depend a lot on lobbyists and interest groups, the executive branch, because as legislators, we're only here 80 days every 2 years. And some of us are more engaged than others, and we don't have staff. And so when all of a sudden I'm voting on healthcare expansion or public education or whatnot, to be a content expert, we don't have the resources. And so that institutional knowledge and that trust we have in some of the people who have served, is certainly valid. And so as long as we are a part-time citizen legislature, I don't think term limits are appropriate. If we become a full-time legislature where this is my full-time job and this is all I do, then maybe let's have that conversation, because then theoretically we are also paying people a good wage to be doing this work. We might have less of us because we don't need as many people to do the work. And so forth. But in terms of what just happened the other day, in terms of the Secretary of State's office rejecting the initiative on term limits, my social media, it says it for itself. First of all, thankful to the Secretary of State's staff for doing the audit that found these irregularities and sounds like some criminal actions.
And the BCI, frankly.
And the BCI, yep. Is this, if it wasn't so dangerous what happened in terms of people just blatantly turning in false signatures or fraudulent signatures, it would be laughable. But our initiated measure process is such an important check on government, whether it's at the local level or the state level. And sure, it's a low threshold and people might critique that in North Dakota, but it's a process that every North Dakotan gets to access. And for, again, my GOP Republican legislative colleagues who are part of the Boschee caucus to turn in, nearly 2/3 of the signatures have been rejected because of them being fraudulent or not having the information they're supposed to have, or a variety of cases that'll continue to be investigated by the Attorney General's office, it sounds like. It is just unfortunate because it's a slap in the face of democracy and the hard work of people who have worked on ballot initiatives in the past across the political spectrum. And so thankful again to the BCI and Secretary of State's office for what they did.
Well, the irony too I'm sorry, just the irony of the people who are screaming loudest about election integrity, right, perpetrating this is not lost on me.
Exactly. Well, and it's not lost on me that the folks that were trying to recall the Fargo school board members not long ago did the same stuff. They're from the same sort of ilk who's crowing about the fact that our election, our elections are fake and all those other things. But I think, Josh, you made a good point. It makes a real mockery of this really important tool that citizens have when folks do this kind of stuff. And Rob, I assume we'll get more into this, but to suggest somehow it's corruption or unconstitutional or whatever. Come on, guys. You turn in nearly 2/3 of your signatures that are illegal. No one's Rob, not to quote you, but nobody's above the law, even when it comes to this stuff. It's embarrassing. And the problem is these guys don't get embarrassed. They do this stuff and they blame somebody else. They don't get embarrassed, and they should be embarrassed. And the people who associate with them, Rick Becker and others, should be embarrassed as well.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's important for folks that are listening to understand that the initiated process, whether you need 15,000 or 36,000 signatures, any organized group is going to try to get more signatures because naturally there are going to be irregularities. Naturally, someone's going to sign it twice because I signed it when I was at the State Fair in Minot, when I was at the mall in Fargo and wasn't paying attention.
Or somebody had cruddy handwriting.
Yeah,
or something
signature
like
doesn't match up and they audit, and they, whatnot. But to have 2/3 and intentionally, the sponsoring committee had the option to not turn in those signatures. And if I was in charge of that or on that sponsoring committee and we had not done an internal audit first, I would have, that's what I would have advocated for. This is not, we don't have the signatures. Let's take the time to get the right signatures we need and do it so that our initiative has its merits to get on the ballot.
Well, what did you accomplish now? Now your measure's not on the ballot. So what did you accomplish through this? All right. Well, Josh, we've gone overtime with you. I appreciate you making time for us, and we'll see you this weekend.
Yeah, always good to be on and look forward to future conversations.
Josh, good to see you. Thank you for your leadership.
Thanks. and thank you for allowing me to join the Bearded Bro Club.
Yeah, it's not a visual medium, Josh, but if for those wondering, he's got a very lovely beard these days. It's looking good.
You got to look real hard to see it, though.
Yeah. Well, that was a good conversation with the House Minority Leader Josh Boschee, and I'm glad he appreciates it. I mean, as a conservative, I really started this podcast wanting to have good conversations, and I think we've been doing that. Obviously when Chad's on, I think he and I have great conversations. I'm trying to interview people from a lot of different points of view, and it's really been fun, and it's gratifying when people say that they appreciate what they're hearing on this podcast. That's pretty awesome.
And I think Josh is just such a good leader and spokesperson for the Democratic Party. I mean, I think that he's really has an ability to really cut through some of the nonsense and talk about kitchen table issues. And I think he's such a talented leader. The Democrats are lucky to have him. The legislature is lucky to have him. And we talked about a lot of different issues there, and he talked about them in pretty great depth. So I just respect Josh so much for the work that he does. The Democrats are lucky to have him.
And pretty candidly too. I appreciate that. I think we go down on specific policy votes. If I was in the legislature, he and I would probably be voting against each other probably most of the time. But I think he's a good person to discuss with. I'd be happy to have him on the other side of the debate because I think that's what our state needs is Republican or Democrat. We just need serious-minded leaders. So, all right, let's talk about this initiated measure thing. Now the latest news for people reading this, I just wrote about it a little bit more before we began recording, but at this point, there's clearly a criminal investigation that's ongoing. I put in an open records request to the BCI, or to the Attorney General's office, asking for the report that they prepared for Secretary Jagger that he based his decision on, and they denied my request based on the exemption for ongoing criminal investigation. So that's it, no question. They're continuing to investigate this as a criminal matter. What was really interesting to me was Jared Hendricks' response. He put up a response on the North Dakota for Term Limits Facebook page. You can read it there. I included it I embedded their post in my column, which you can go check out as well. But this is from Jared Hendricks, who's the chairman. He says, "We are deeply disappointed in the Secretary of State's decision to exercise unprecedented and unconstitutional discretion to dismiss the signatures of thousands of North Dakotans who support term limits." And then he goes on and he cites polling that the term limits are really popular. It polls over 80%. I don't think that surprises anybody. He goes on to cite the fact that over 46,000 people signed the petition, although at this point, I think we have to call into question that number. And then basically said they're going to pursue all legal options to push this. And when I read that response, Chad, I thought, well, this is exactly what Donald Trump does. When he's confronted with things he doesn't like, he just goes over the top, impugns the motivations of his critics, and just carries on like nothing happened and they couldn't possibly have done anything wrong.
Well, and I would just ask Jared the question, if 80% of North Dakotans support term limits, why did you have to turn in 29,000 fraudulent signatures, alleged fraudulent signatures? I think, again, it's the lack of responsibility here. I think Josh's point earlier about, the sponsoring committee or who's ever leading the signature gathering process, you look at the signatures before you turn them in. And if 2/3 of them are fraudulent, and it must have been pretty obvious if they dug this deep into these things, they take some responsibility. I also think, we can't just act like this is just Charles Tuttle or Jared Hendricks or whatever. It's my understanding, based on your column, that Jared is running Rick Becker's campaign.
Well, he's
Jared.
I got corrected on that. He is a consultant. Andrea Tolman is officially the campaign manager. She called me and corrected that. Jared Hendricks is acting as a consultant. But I mean, you at the North Dakota Republican Party district conventions, Jared Hendricks is right there next to Rick Becker at all of those local conventions. So suffice it to say, he's very involved in Becker's campaign.
And we know that Jared was also Kevin Kramer's deputy campaign manager against Heidi Heitkamp a few years ago as well. But it is just, it's I didn't expect this much anger from people who are proponents of initiated measure and constitutional measure. They're angry about the fact that they've made a mockery of this. There's already enough reasons to make it harder to get things on the ballot, but this kind of fraud is just people should be embarrassed, and they're not.
Right, and let's be clear. It's alleged. The Secretary of State. He cited his reasons. It's still under investigation. But let's look at some of the reasons, right? And stipulating for a moment that all of this is correct and the Secretary of State got this right, which I don't have any reason to believe that they didn't. They said several signatures of circulators were likely forged on affidavits in the presence of a notary public. Therefore, all affidavits notarized by this notary were not counted. So that means that basically they had a notary who was notarizing, like watching somebody who wasn't that person sign an affidavit and then notarized it anyway. And they say, okay, well, if we can't trust this notary anymore, then everything that they notarized is out, which I think is fair, right? Once you've sort of crossed that threshold and you've impugned yourself in that way, I think that's fair. They also had, some circulators were not North Dakota qualified electors as required. Some of those individuals were not citizens of the United States. Now, here's another one. A sampling of 87 circulators indicated that several were offered or paid bonuses based on the number of signatures they obtained, which is prohibited by the North Dakota Century Code. Now, it's one thing to have signatures, and sometimes you can even have thousands of signatures dismissed because somebody signed and they're from Minnesota and they didn't know that they couldn't sign it, or somebody didn't put their whole address down. They just put Minot or something instead of putting those things happen. What the Secretary of State is enumerating here are decisions, right? Somebody made the decision to notarize signatures that were, as the Secretary of State puts it, likely forged. Somebody made the decision to allow people who weren't even United States citizens to circulate petitions, despite the law requiring that everybody circulating a petition has to be a qualified elector, right? The law says you can't pay people by the signature, and yet they were being offered to do that. Those are decisions somebody in this ballot measure campaign made. Those aren't just mistakes.
Well, and these laws are not hard to follow, and they're widely understood. I mean, I've been somewhat, involved in signature gathering where it was clear during the, if people were collecting signatures, people are checking if they're a qualified elector. Everybody knows you don't get to pay per signature. I mean, that's just sort of everybody knows in this thing. Again, I mean, and Drew Wrigley, in BCI, it's not like Drew Wrigley, some big liberal out there that's just trying to hurt these guys. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's the constant victimhood of these folks it's hard to take.
One thing too is the statement from Hendricks. I mean, it just begins with two things that are demonstrably untrue, right? I mean, the first thing he says is that this was an unprecedented action by the Secretary of State. No, it wasn't. He's kept measures off the ballot before because they didn't get the right number of signatures, or they had too many signatures disqualified. That's happened before, right? We know it's happened before. It happened in 2012 with 2 ballot measures because of signature fraud perpetrated by a group of NDSU football players, and the Secretary of State kept it off the ballot. And I think I don't think they appealed that one to the Supreme Court. But the cycle before that, there was a pharmacy measure that the Secretary of State kept off the ballot, and they appealed it to the state Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld it. So it's happened before. It's not unprecedented. And then he called it unconstitutional. But the Constitution is the place where you have to be a qualified elector in order to circulate a petition. It comes from there. And who assigns the Secretary of State to be the one who reviews the petitions? The state constitution. So if you want to argue that Jagger got it wrong and that signatures weren't really forged and that the circulators weren't really from another country, then okay, I guess if the Secretary of State got facts wrong, then fine. But to call this unprecedented and unconstitutional to begin with is not true. Not true.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. It's Trumpy in the response. It's a lack of responsibility taking. And you're right. I mean, things have gone to the court. We know that the good government measure last time got thrown off the ballot in a court. These guys have the ability to go to a court. But to use words like unprecedented, unconstitutional, again, for some reason, these guys don't think they can ever lose. It's always somebody else's fault.
It's either they win or somebody cheated.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting at the GOP convention if that's the same attitude for candidates moving forward. But yeah, it's all, I'd like to say it's surprising, but it's not surprising. I brought up the Fargo school board recall. It was the same thing. They turned in signatures like with Mickey Mouse and signatures from Minnesota and other places were just just a basic looking at the sheet. You'd know these were bad signatures. And, and again, they claimed it was fraud or, it wasn't fair and they were getting cheated, whatever. They didn't go to court. So it's all just, it's disappointing.
I mean, in this moment, there's some posturing. And let's talk about the implications here for Rick Becker, because there are several. First of all, the guy who's Rick Becker's on the sponsoring committee, right? State Representative Rick Becker, who's running for the U.S. Senate from, the sort of far right extreme faction of the NDGOP. He's running for the U.S. Senate. And boy, have they had can we talk about that? First of all, Donald Trump endorses Hoeven and not Becker, right? Which, first of all, is hilarious because, right, Becker was posturing himself. He's pandering on the election conspiracy stuff. He's going to go to Washington. He's going to put Anthony Fauci in jail. Like, he's pandering to that crowd. And then Trump endorses Hoeven, right? So that's hilarious to begin with. And then this happens to their term limits ballot measure, which is also hilarious. And did you see Rick Becker's quote to the Associated Press about why Dave Kolpak in the Associated Press had an article up, and he's he asked Becker about being on the sponsoring committee, and Becker was like, "Oh, I wasn't involved." Here's a direct quote. Bismarck Representative Rick Becker, who founded the Boschee caucus, said he joined the sponsoring committee to provide name recognition, but was not involved in the petition process. And I'm thinking, boy, talk about having the courage of your convictions.
Well, yeah, and he's saying it out loud. You're supposed to keep that inside.
That's the quiet part.
Going back to the Trump endorsement of Hoeven, I hate the fact that Hoeven wanted Trump's endorsement. In an ideal world, here's a guy who's been a multi-term senator. He shouldn't need this guy's endorsement.
I still maintain that Trump needed Hoeven more than Hoeven needed Trump. And I say that, you look what just happened. I don't know if you saw what just happened with Mo Brooks, where Trump pulled his endorsement from Mo Brooks and said it was because Brooks, recently made comments about how, we need to move past the 2020 election. And that's just unacceptable. Well, the comments that Mo Brooks made were in August, so they weren't all that recent. What is more recent is the polling that shows that Mo Brooks probably isn't going to win in that Republican primary. And who doesn't want to back a loser? Donald Trump, because the only thing he's got going for him right now is this supposed kingmaker status within the Republican primary process.
Well, and not to mention, I think John Hoeven has said we need to move past the 2020 election a time or two as well.
Right.
And Trump is happy to endorse.
Right, because Trump, it's about Trump wanting to endorse winners, not Trump wanting to endorse, right, like doing the ideological. If he was doing the ideological thing, then it would obviously be Rick Becker. Rick Becker's the Trumpy candidate in Republican in the North Dakota Senate primary. But he endorsed Hoeven because Hoeven's going to win.
So do you think Hoeven is going to the convention? Has that been determined yet?
Yes, he's absolutely going to the convention.
And are they confident?
Now I'm getting this. This is through source to us. So this is like third hand. So I have not seen, but what I'm told consistently by a lot of people who I trust, they're saying that, and I think even Becker has said the same thing, which makes me think that they're all probably seeing the same thing. It seems like Hoeven probably has the slight edge.
Really? Okay.
50, I think the number I heard thrown around is they're thinking he has probably about 58% of the delegates. Now, the thing is it's one thing, how many of those people are actually going to show up in Bismarck? And sure. how many are going to be seated, when the actual vote for the Senate endorsement happens? That's a different question.
Well, and then Becker coming out this week and saying he'll follow the endorsement of the convention, probably a good talking point for him, but no risk. He knows that if he doesn't win the convention, he has no path at the primary to win at all. So,
and let's be honest, if he decides he wants to run in the primary, they could just invent a conspiracy theory about how the convention was unfair, and now Rick Becker has no choice but to continue pursuing justice on the June primary. That's how it'll play out if they decide to do it.
Yeah, it's not that complicated to figure out, is it? I mean, the script is the same
when you don't have
all these things.
When you don't have principles or ethics or anything, then the world becomes a blank slate. It can be whatever you want it to be.
Yep.
You don't have to live in reality.
So, there's other constitutional measures that are supposed to be on the ballot. It doesn't seem like anybody's turned in signatures yet. Is that true?
I need to look up because I've been so focused on the term limits one. So
did marijuana decided not to turn things in, right?
Marijuana.
They didn't get there.
So as of right now, the only one being circulated is related to constitutional measures requiring a 60% majority vote. So that's the one that's kind of sort of backed by the Chamber of Commerce. My understanding is that one's stalled. And if you look at their messaging, I think you were mentioning this to me off air. If you look at their messaging and stuff, they haven't really been updating their social media feeds or anything. I have a feeling that effort probably stalled.
And when do they have to have their signatures in? Because I think they're shooting for the primary, weren't they?
They were. So would be April 22nd. 2022.
Okay.
That would be 1 year from when it was approved for circulation. That's the absolute last date. If they wanted to make June, they would have had to have turned them in on February. And I guess April 22nd is also the deadline for the November election. So they have a little less than a month yet.
But they're way past the try to get it on the primary ballot.
That was February. So it would have had, so if they're going to be on at all, it's going to be on the November ballot. And at this point, I would question if they're going to be on at all, but who knows? Maybe.
Yeah, and as I said to you offline, maybe it's not so easy to change the Constitution for those folks who want to make it harder to change the Constitution.
Marzy's Law.
Yeah.
is my rebuttal.
That's getting dated now, Rob.
Maybe.
Come on.
Maybe. I don't like the initiated measure and probably I think all the people who disagree with me on my dislike of the initiated measure process, I'll be honest, is most people, right and left, frankly. I think they're probably frustrated because, assuming everything gets upheld, everything that the Secretary of State has found gets upheld, and I don't have reason to doubt it. That is a big arrow in my quiver, because my argument is this process is too open and too easily manipulated, and we shouldn't have to rely on the BCI and the Secretary of State to continuing to find these problems to protect our state constitution from bad ideas.
And some might suggest that the process works just fine because the Secretary of State's office and the BCI made sure that this didn't get on the ballot.
Maybe, but we don't have time to get into this debate. But if you look at some of the stuff that's happening, like at the Ethics Commission right now, and the way that they're starting to use some of that law, that's also an argument that when the voters weigh in on this stuff, they are not considering all the implications of what is often very, very consequential and very complicated public policy, the nuances of which just don't get considered in a general election race.
Yeah, I think the headline should be, again, Oban trusts the voters. Port thinks the voters should not have a voice.
Yeah, Port agrees with the founding fathers that direct democracy is stupid. That's what it should be. I again will vote James Madison, or quote James Madison, who once said that even if every single member of the masses was Socrates, and I'm paraphrasing here, was Socrates, it would still be a mob.
Yeah, again, I think we really need to, in this day and age where we simplify all political and complicated issues down to just really short things, Oban trusts voters, Port thinks all voters are dummies.
And this is exactly why I don't think we should legislate at the ballot box, because everything gets dumbed down into little talking points that can be read by Kelsey Grammer. Kelsey Grammer is the reason we have Marzy's Law in the state constitution, over the objection of our judges and our defense attorneys and our prosecutors and our victims advocates. Kelsey Grammer was on television and said that this was a good idea, so we voted for it.
Your hostility towards Frasier is
really something I like Kelsey Grammer. Into. I loved Frasier, even the episode that Chris Berg was on. And
whoa!
Did you know that
on an episode of Frasier?
Chris Berg was absolutely on an episode of Frasier in a towel, no less.
What?
Yes. Yeah, that's a real thing. Chris Berg, by the way, is a former I don't even know what the hell does he do now? He's still on the radio, I think, somewhere. He was on Valley News Live for a long time and then quit because they asked him to get vaccinated, right? Which is a business, a career decision I don't understand. And now I think he's working somewhere in the Scott Hennon universe of crack pottery somewhere. I don't know. Somewhere. I don't know what he's doing now. He's still on Twitter.
You used to work in that world of crack pottery too, didn't you? Back in the day?
I did, and I have lots of stories about why I don't anymore. A lot of which have to do with me not being willing to write things that I don't agree with for money. Anyway, wow. Boy, being very candid right now. Let's move on to something else. So what do you think? What do you think the end game is for the initiated measure? Because they're gonna. I mean, Hendricks says they're gonna pursue every legal challenge, and I'm sure they'll find an attorney who will be happy to bill them hourly. To
I can't imagine that Al Jaeger didn't do all his due diligence here, and his staff, his staff is exceptional by and large. I don't think they didn't do their due diligence here, and bring it to the courts. I think Hendricks and his ilk are going to lose.
I just don't see how it is. It is interesting because in the past, there does seem to be a little bit of a shift in how it's enforced. Because in the past, it's kind of been, you had to go through and you had to like invalidate every signature, right? Or like it was very screwed. Like you had, and they still kind of did that. But if you look at the thing with the notary, like they're kind of arguing, listen, once we get to a point where we've discredited somebody who's involved in this process, that taints everything that they've touched, right? Which I think is most notable with the notary problem, where they found there was a notary who apparently notarized a lot of the petitions, and that person was caught, at least in some instances, notarizing a signature that was false, as the Secretary of State alleges. Therefore, everything that they notarized was thrown out. That's a pretty, now I agree with it, because it's kind of the fruit of the tainted tree situation. Once they've proven you can't trust them, and a lot of it's built on the idea that the Secretary of State, we don't give the Secretary of State the time. If you look at the timeline he has to verify these signatures, or the resources to go through and verify 31,000, 46,000 signatures, whatever the number is, they're not going to do it. They're not going to contact every single person. So it's really what they do is they take samples, they try to find problems. And so I think it's appropriate. Once you cross a certain threshold, you say, listen, we can't trust you anymore. Therefore, everything you've touched is now tainted.
Well, and Jagger, I know, takes the notary process deadly serious. I mean, that's actually housed in his office, I believe.
It is, yeah.
People who register for notary and that kind of thing. So, again, if they've got concerns, they should take it to court. I agree with you. They'll be able to find an attorney to do that. I don't think Jagger's office is going to willy-nilly throw out signatures on something like this. I'm sure they did their due diligence, and I have confidence that this is not going to be on the ballot.
Let's see. Predictions for the Democratic convention coming up. What's going to be the headline coming out?
Yeah, so I'll see you up there. I think one of the things that's really difficult for the Dems right now is trying to get people motivated to see a path forward to victory. I think that's showing up in candidate recruitment. I assume it's going to show up in delegate participation. I also think the fact that the convention's in Minot and the base of the Democratic Party is 300 miles away in Cass County will probably affect the amount of people who will be there in person. So I worry that the headline's going to be Democrats have 4 open slots or something like that coming out of the convention. So I'm excited to see who the Secretary of State candidate is. I think this PSC candidate, Trygve Hammer, an incredible background.
He's really got an impressive resume. So that'll be. I tried to book him for this show actually, but he couldn't accommodate us. I guess it's something with work or something. I don't know. I'm working on getting him possibly next week. So that'll be really interesting. And yeah, I'm going to be at the state Democratic convention. I think we're going to maybe even try to record a show from there. Senator Kevin Cramer's coming up on Friday. A lot to talk with him about. We have the Supreme Court hearings. We have Ukraine going on. I have a feeling, he endorsed John Hoeven in the Senate primary. So lots of things to talk with him about. And this weekend, I'm looking for, although I want to predict, I can't participate. I don't have standing. They wouldn't even give me media credentials. But I want to petition the North Dakota Democratic Party to stop calling it cornhole. That's a horrible name for the game. I hate it. Every time somebody calls it cornhole, I want to throw a book through a window. Stop it. Just call it beanbag or something, because that's gross. I hate it.
So, but you have to start at ESPN. ESPN now shows collegiate cornhole on ESPN Ocho or something like that.
Don't Google that. Don't Google collegiate cornhole, because that's not good. At least not at work. There is that's terrible. Absolutely terrible. Chad wants to get off the air now. So that's my message for the Democratic Party. Call it beanbag. That's much better. All right. On that note, we're going to end this episode of Plain Talk. Thanks, Chad.
Thanks, Rob. See you Saturday.
Want more political news like this? Visit inforum.news/port to get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Don't wait. Get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now.